Hello and welcome to the first exercise in the Intro to Python video series. In this video, we will look at a problem statement and build a solution together so you get a better understanding of the concepts learned so far. Alright, let's dive in. So here is a problem statement. Given a number, calculate the factorial of that number. And if the number is negative, print a message saying that the factorial can only be computed for positive numbers. And if you're not familiar with the factorial of a positive number n is basically just the product of all numbers from 1 to that number n. So n factorial, represented as shown here, is basically the product of 1, 2, all the way up to n. So for example, 5 factorial is 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5, which is 120. So let's see how we might solve this. We'll break this problem down into a couple of different sections. First, we need to get the input number from the user. Next, we need to check if the number is positive. If the number is positive, then we need to compute the factorial. And if the number is negative, we need to print the message factorial cannot be computed. Factorial can only be computed for positive numbers. Alright, so we've already seen how to take input from the user, so we can do something like n equals int input, enter a number you wish to compute the factorial for. So now if you run this, it will ask you to enter a number. You can enter some number like 10. So right now, our code doesn't do anything, it just takes the input. The next thing is to check if the number is positive. So to recall, you can use an if condition to do this. So you can write something like if n greater than 0, then we need to compute the factorial. So we'll just add in some placeholder code for now. So let's just say print factorial is ... and we'll fill this in later. And if n is less than 0, so the else condition, you want to print the message that we have here, factorial. Alright, let's try running this now. So if you add some positive number, let's just say 5, it will say factorial is, which means it will execute this code over here. And if you enter some negative number, minus 100, it will say factorial can only be computed for positive numbers. So we have some part of the problem statement already solved. Now, the section that is left is to compute the actual factorial. Let's take a look at how we can compute the factorial. So let's bring up the equation for n factorial. So n factorial is basically the product of all the numbers starting from 1 all the way up to n. So all you need to do is to have some variable that goes from 1 and increments by 1 and goes all the way up to n. And while you increment, you keep taking the product of that number. So we can have, let's just say, some counter which starts from value 1, and we want this to go from 1 to n. And we'll initialize a factorial variable, which is where we will save our output. So their factorial will be stored. Now we'll add a while loop saying while counter is less than or equal to n, your factorial is equal to factorial times counter, and then you increment counter by 1. And then in the end, you can print factorial is, factorial. So if you run this, and let's just say I enter number 5, and then it will say factorial is 120, which is exactly what we have. We can try some other numbers, so let's just say we add 3, and then you get factorial is 6. So 3 factorial is 3 times 2 times 1, which is 6. So let's try to uncover what exactly might be happening here when we compute the factorial. So I'm going to copy paste this into a separate code block so we can dissect this. I'll maybe add an additional declaration of n equals 5 so that it's independent from the block above. Now, if you run this and if you print again again in the end factorial. And if you run this, you will have factorial is 120 because we have set n equals 5. So what is happening here is you're initializing counter with value 1, and you initialize the variable called factorial at value 1. Now when the while starts, it will check this condition. If counter is less than or equal to n. So now we have counter 1 and n equals 5. So this condition is valid. And then you start from factorial, which starts from 1, and then it multiplies it with 1. So it ends up being 1. And you increment the counter to be 2. Now we check if 2 is less than 5. You take the product, factorial is now 1 times 2, and you increment the counter and so on until you get to the end. Let's break this down maybe by looking at the example of 5 factorial. So we have 5 factorial equals 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. And then what the first loop, or the first execution of this loop does, is it takes 1 times 2. And then it groups it together, and it stores that into the factorial. And then you have the value 2 showing up here. In the next iteration, it would take 2 times 3, so your counter will be 3 in the next iteration, and then it would take the product of 2 and 3, and then it will store that into factorial, so now inside you will have 6. And then the next iteration, the counter increments, now it will be 4, and then it will take the product of 6 times 4, and then you end up getting 24. And finally, counter will be 5, and then it will take the product of 24 times 5, and you get 120. And then the counter increments again, and you will get 6 less than or equal to 5, which is not true, and then it exits the loop, and then it prints that the factorial is 120. So we can actually try and print the intermediate values of factorial, and you will see intermediate factorial is, and then you will see exactly this kind of thing. So maybe let me copy paste this over here for your reference. So you will see that first you have the value 1, which is where it starts, and then you have 1 times 2, which is what you get here. Then you have 2 times 3, which is 6. Then you have 6 times 4, which is 24. And finally you have 24 times 5, which is 120. So that brings us to the end of this video. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.